I think I could really be very happy in almost any deeply contemplative tradition. It just turns out that most of my practice, particularly at the beginning, has been Buddhist. And I think it's just the meditative traditions of the East, the Buddhist tradition is just one of the sharpest, clearest, deepest, and it's sort of put front and center. And all of the great sutras and tantras, which are very, very important, are all there as a sort of a secondary support and a way to help you interpret these experiences that you have. But you can find, again, very, very similar great traditions. I'm very, very drawn to Vedanta. I've studied that extensively. All of the great Christian and Jewish mystics are really extraordinary. And so that's always, I've been drawn to that from as early as I can really remember. But what the great contemplative traditions have done in the early experiences that I've had, my first real sesshin with a Zen teacher was with Katagiri Roshi, who was one of the main lineage holders of Suzuki Roshi, who sort of really opened it up for an enormous number of people in the 60s and 70s out of San Francisco and Green Gulch and so on. And then I eventually studied with a lot of really great Dzogchen teachers in Vajrayana. The important thing that, well, the first thing you learn in Zen that you're not going to really talk about your Kensho or your Satori because, then it means you really haven't had a Kensho or a Satori. But if you don't talk about it, then people think you're a nut. So let's just say that whatever experience I had, and I can talk about some of them if you want, but they're paradoxical because just as you saw about the non-grasping mind, it simply is something that's arising moment to moment, and your relationship to it is not such that it's inside you or outside you. It simply is the suchness of everything that's arising. And you, as an individual, are simply part of the suchness that is arising. Paradoxically, you also inhabit this particular body-mind. And that's why the traditions are pretty unanimous that every human being is a perfect and mysterious mixture of divine and human, or a perfect intersection of emptiness and form. And it's that intersection that's the bitch. Because it's like, whoa. And that's the fun part. And that's where it's like 90% of the koans of any religion come out of that intersection because the two sides of the street are pretty clear. It's where those puppies run into each other. That is Excedrin headache, number 28, 29, 30, 31. The great thing it did for me, though, is very early on in pursuing Buddhist meditation, there's probably the greatest of all the Buddhist philosophers is an Indian named Nagarjuna. And virtually all of Mahayana and Vajrayana lineages trace their lineage to this gentleman. We know very little about him. He lived in about the 2nd century AD, or Common Era, about the same time as Plotinus. And in almost one stroke, the whole Madhyamaka Buddhism would seem to have been born with this fellow. And again, right about the same time Plotinus was, and they were the first truly non-dual realizers. All of the great spiritual realizers of the axial age, which is the name that Karl Jaspers gave to that great period starting about the 6th century BC, they produced Gautama Buddha and Lao Tzu and the same Socrates, Plato, and so on. Extraordinary explosion of spiritual realization that swept the world around that period. And most of it marked a shift from merely subtle level phenomena to causal emptiness, an understanding of the one that is not manifest. And Parmenides is associated with that in the West. There's evidence that Parmenides might have met Socrates when he was 12, and if so, there's probably a transmission right on down from Socrates to Plato, all the way unbroken to Plotinus. I mean, a 6th century broken transmission of that in the West is just astonishing. And in the East, you can do runs like that on almost any of the traditions. Really quite extraordinary. But this whole, with Nagarjuna, at least two things are very, very important. One was that if you look at what Gautama Buddha did, it was very similar to what Patanjali and many of the yogis up to that period had done. Gautama Buddha's actual practice wasn't that different than the limbs of yoga. And the idea was to meditate in a certain way and get into an unmanifest state of cessation. Nirod, nirvikalpa. And under those circumstances, you basically get off the wheel of samsara. So samsara as a whole is bad, nirvana is good. get rid of samsara, get into nirvana, got it made. And people have a hard time understanding nirvana. What does it mean to have no self, no desire, no thirst, no suffering, no pain? You go into that every night in deep dreamless sleep. You're plunged into it. And then it's a very similar analogy, and a lot of traditions maintain that. So you know exactly what nirvana is. You plunge into it, and it's great. It's a nice sort of vacation from you. And that's what it is. So you wake up each and every morning and go, yes! Got rid of that asshole again last night. But of course what you are is you're reverting to that great I amness that's also unqualifiable emptiness. How to get those two together was the trick. And Nagarjuna and Plotinus were two of the first that really had a breakthrough on that. And probably it's reasonable to suppose that they were both one of the first to have an experience of sahaj, or one taste, or this other state where emptiness and form are not two. That which is emptiness is not other than form, that which is form is not other than emptiness. And all of that really means is that all this form that is arising is shimmering, it's transparent. It's arising as and within big mind, so to speak. It's the ripples on this ocean of the non-seeking mind. And that was a real breakthrough realization, because all of a sudden you didn't have to get away from this in order to get emptiness. You could find emptiness in the midst of this, and that immediately gave rise not only to Mahayana, which is I vow to compassionately continue to interact with samsara, but it gave rise to Vajrayana, which is I vow to have sex with all sentient beings because it's fun. Now, that's very close to what Vajrayana is saying. Play with it. Once you go through these, everything is allowed. The 5 poisons can be transmuted. They're all 5 wisdoms. Everything that's arising is arising as your original face. So it's all allowed. Sex is allowed, meat is allowed, alcohol is allowed, and so on. Now again, you have to be very careful, because there's a thin line between being addicted and calling that Vajrayana and actually being not attached to it and playing with it as a luminous dance. And so that's all paths have their trap, and the Betty Ford Clinic is the main trap of Vajrayana. So what Nagarjuna did, though, in order to make that happen, is he gave a devastating critique of any philosopher or any approach that tried to take some relative quality and make it absolute. So his notion of shunyata, or emptiness, is that it was devoid of drishti. Any sort of conceptualization would not apply, including the one I just said. He won't even let you say that. And so it's a radical house cleaning for big mind. It's a radical mirror cleaning. So you're not going to do something like say, the absolute is all good. Because if it's all good, then it's going to exclude anything that looks bad or evil, and therefore it's not all-inclusive. Or it's all-knowing. Any of those are opposites. They're all opposites. Therefore, they can't be all-inclusive. Nagarjuna has an unrelenting method to stop you from doing that. And right when you say, there, I'm not going to do that anymore, he'll say, no, you can't do that either. I mean, he just won't stop until you wake up. So by going through that, here's what that did for me, and the corresponding realization that Katagiri and many other teachers were very generous enough to help me understand. The best thing it did for my writing is I never bought into today's craze of identifying quantum physics with a Tao, or Gaia with a Tao, or systems theory with the Tao. All of those are relative. All of those are nice things in the relative world, but they're all part of the relative world. And if you go identifying big mind or Brahman or Tao with that, you're going to be in trouble. Philosophically, it'll fall apart. And I've lived long enough now. I mean, I'm closer to 60 than I am to 50. I've lived a lot. It's my first book when I was 23. I have seen 100 fads come and go, each of them identifying spirit with the latest whatever it was that was supposed to be the ultimate reality and that nobody can even remember anymore. So by being ensconced in emptiness, that let me always know that I was writing about samsara. And that stopped me from basically absolutizing any of the stuff I was doing. You hold it more lightly. And because you hold it more lightly, you're also more willing to revise it. You're also more willing to go from Wilbur 1 to Wilbur 2 to Wilbur 3 to Wilbur 4 to Wilbur 5 and so on. And don't think that you're giving up spirit, because you're not. Spirit is that which is aware of Wilbur 1 and Wilbur 2 and Wilbur 3 and Wilbur 4. It's not any of those. So that was the best thing that did. And then my own personal development just continued to unfold with various teachers, and it was helped enormously, again, by East and West. It was helped as much by Gestalt therapy, getting at shadow elements. You can't get at a lot of the shadow elements with meditation either. But Gestalt therapy won't get you meditation. So, we've got to have an integral approach. We know too much to settle for less. And on the one hand, it's daunting. It's an awful lot of stuff that we have to do. But you're not going to settle for less. Like I say, so on the one hand, it's like, oh, no. But on the other hand, it's hot dog, And like I say, anybody can make pioneering contributions now, because we're judging on the curve. And there is nothing out there. So you can write pioneering textbooks, hell, on your way home.